Ed Hill and Matt Ryan, and they'll be telling us about integrating human behaviour and epidemiological modelling, unlocking the remaining challenges and bad modelling. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Great. So welcome back, everyone. So yes, this is a two-part talk from Matt and myself. So the first part's going to be covering a perspective type piece that a few of us have been involved in. And then I'll pass over to Matt, who will describe this bad modelling, which is quite a, I think, memorable acronym. So just initially on this unlocking the remaining challenges, and this does have a epidemiological focus in terms of incorporating human behaviour. But from where this arose, and so there was an event 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago now, back at the University of Warwick. So this was also actually the time we were putting in the application for this satellite programme. There was essentially a joint workshop through the Applied Maths and the Applied Maths group and the Juniper partnership. So Juniper is it's predominantly UK network of UK-based researchers who have a common shared interest in quantitative modelling, infectious disease control, and use of modelling to help inform health policy. So with thanks to the support from that, we had organised an event on modelling human behaviour for tackling societal challenges. And so this was an event organised by myself. I was at University of Warwick at that time. And then from Juniper side, there was Kirsty and Emily Nixon. And then from University of Warwick, we had Martine. And then so Stephen Parnell, who does work in kind of infectious disease epidemiology, but on the crop science side. So me and Stephen are actually co-supervising a PhD student looking at crop grower behaviour and impact for pest and disease control. So you're welcome to ask me more about that during upcoming days or during the breaks. But through this event, we had a set of longer talks and short form talks. Through sharing the slides, this event page is still available from all the talks there. But from what happened from this was then there was an ongoing smaller working group from which emerged this perspectives type paper, where we were considering what we thought to be the broad challenges which we were facing in trying to integrate human behaviour into epidemiological models. And then we wanted to try to suggest some recommendations, both short or actionable things, say more immediately, and then longer term vision across this. So I think there were 5 main areas of challenges. So one is interdisciplinary working more generally, which I'll come back to. But just to step through some of the main points from the 4 main challenge areas. So one was actually just on the behavioural science theory side itself. So from comments raised previously, thinking about an outbreak disease context, does existing behavioural science theory, is it actually appropriate for, say, a pandemic scenario? Taking existing survey data, etc., so generalizability of existing findings. There's this quite a lot of work might have been done, say, on university student populations, because these might be populations who sign up to take part in certain surveys, etc. And so that links again to the appropriateness of the type of methodologies used for trying to quantify human behaviour. One of our main discussion points we're having during this week and ongoing regarding data. When collecting data, we have to think about striking this balance of we can't just collect data, usually can't just collect data because we would like to. Usually we have to have thought about what is the purpose for collecting and attributes of data. So we have to go through the ethical approvals, etc., and think about storage, archiving, all that has to be thought about, put in place. Bringing in various different data streams and sources, how can we usefully bring that into models, especially if we've got qualitative type data as well as quantitative. And also what data already exists that's out there that we could be repurposing or tweaking that would actually be useful for models that we have. On the actual model structures that we're using, that trade-off between trying to capture more realism versus then what we're outputting being interpretable. The question of should behavior be explicitly included in the model might be worth posing. Is there a form of checklist that could be constructed, especially when we're working with interdisciplinary teams, for what items should be included in said models? And then the questions, perhaps thinking back to data, of being able to calibrate and validate them. And then with usability by others, what tools might be useful. So you might think about, say, Shiny apps or online dashboards. And then on the user side, is there enough support there for them to use these tools without kind of breaking assumptions or taking away implausible scenarios, which can be an issue. And this also links to communication. So perhaps from the policy side, what is their objective, their perspective, this matters. Another aspect is public involvement. So where might the public be able to contribute to this overall research process? And one of these feedback loops is through the use of this modeling, actually, may that impact behavior itself. So if we're saying through this model, we therefore project behavior will be altered this way. If the public sees these results, how will the public themselves react? So it's quite a meta level feedback loop there. So then another aspect of the paper was then these recommendations. So then within the interdisciplinary realm, there's talk here about how to build teams and also longevity of the team. So a common issue found is funding support. You might build a team initially, but how do we get longevity for this? Establishing a common language and standardization of interdisciplinary methods. So again, these are aspects we're returning to this week. Cool, that's my summary done. And with that, I'll pass over to Matt, who will talk about some specific modeling that's been done.
Thanks, Ed. So I'm going to talk to you about some modeling that a few of us in the room here have worked on. This builds off what we call, well, I'm lovingly calling bad modeling, which stands for behavior and disease, but it's much more fun to say bad. Where the concept there is we took a behavioral science theory, in particular the health belief model, which is a psychosociological model about why we engage in health behaviors, and we use that for justification for the behavioral dynamics in our transmission model. But the work I'm going to talk about today is a bit of an extension of that, which starts with some data. So during the COVID-19 pandemic in Australia, there was a group from Melbourne University that got survey data out fairly quickly. So this is similar for those of you who were here on Monday. Henry Potts talked about his survey. He got out really, like their survey, they got out real quick. This is very similar. And this was tracking about 2,000 people a week to a fortnight, asking a whole bunch of questions. And one of the questions they asked was around, do you intend to take a COVID-19 test? And that's what we're seeing on the plot here. This is the different colors are like, how many symptoms do you have? That changes how likely you are to go and get tested. And one of the things that's really noticeable over here is those lovely waves we're getting in this data. And surprise, surprise, those waves match up pretty well with actual epidemic waves. So there seems to be some form of relationship between the epidemic that was happening in Australia at the time and people's willingness to engage in COVID-19 tests if they were showing symptoms. So a few things that we have specifically from this data set then is we're looking at a very specific disease. We're looking at something that's COVID-like. We have a very specific behavior we want to try and capture, which is the intention to take a test if you're unwell. And there seems to be some feedback between case numbers going around and people taking tests, or people being willing to take a test, I should say. So how did we build up a model to try and think about this? I should say this is fully like exploring the model, not connecting it to the data, but the data informed what we were going to do. So we started with an SIRS structure. So to make sure we're all on the same page, people can start susceptible, where you're healthy but can get sick. You can transition to being sick, infectious, where you're sick and can get others sick. And after time, you might become recovered and you might lose your immunity over time. That's the arrow going back to S. But that's not very COVID-like. We know that's not how COVID acts. And so we might extend that out and go, well, there's some form of latent period or exposed class where you've interacted with sick people and you're sick, but you're not ready to transmit the disease yet. And there's a lot of asymptomatics in COVID. So we've included asymptomatics in there. So there's some probability you're asymptomatic. But we're trying to think about behavior now. So this is just assuming everyone acts the same in this standard structure. So one approach we might take is to split that in people who are never going to test, they don't care, they're not willing to take a test if they're showing symptoms, and those who are willing to test when they're showing symptoms. And what we have on the screen here is we kind of have this alpha going from our things with a subscript B to things with a subscript N. That's denoting people who are going to lose interest in testing. And we have those omegas going from the N's to the B's, are those people who are going to gain interest in testing. Now, these have functional forms that I'm not going to show on the slides, but these capture those behavior dynamics informed by behavioral science theory. So there's that idea of like a social contagion aspect and this feedback to the infection rate. And this is shorthand for saying the SNs go to the SBs, the ENs go to the EBs, and so forth. But we said that the behavioral dynamics we were seeing, the willingness to test, was related to the advertised test rates, but that's not shown in this model. So something we added was this specific testing class. So if you're willing to test upon showing symptoms, you can take a test, and if you've tested positive, you get pushed down into this testing class where your behavior is static for as long as you're in there. Because once you've taken a test, you have taken a test, you've been observed. We don't really care if you stop being willing to take a test then. But a few things we want to keep in mind is behavior is dynamic over the course of the epidemic, so that can change. We have this idea of test effectiveness as well. So this is a quantity we can actually try and measure from real world trials of the effectiveness of something. So it captures ideas of how well is the test going to return a positive if you're actually infectious. So if you have the infection, is it going to turn a positive? And also, are you going to take the test? So even though our behavior is willingness to test, people can still choose not to take the test, and that's captured in this PT component. And as I mentioned, if you've tested positive, we're going to assume you isolate a bit, but you can't go back to N while you're in that class. But one of the interesting things we found out here is described by these plots here, and there's a lot going on, so let's have a quick chat about it. On the x-axis, we have kind of the base, how infectious is the disease. So how many people are you likely to get sick if you dropped in a completely susceptible population? And on the y-axis, we have how socially transmittable is the behavior. So how much are people going to pick up on testing because everyone else is testing? And this dashed gray line is our reproduction threshold for the full model. That's when we change from having no infection to some infection. And these are steady states we're looking at here. On the left-hand side is our observed infection. That's actually what we see of the epidemic. That's all the people who tested positive. So that's our T class. Whereas the red stuff is the actual infection burden. So that's everyone who tested, plus all the asymptomatics, plus all those who either tested negative or didn't test. And so the way we read this, we can see as we go from left to right, as the infection becomes more infectious, we see more sick people in the population. That makes sense. But something interesting happens as we start making the behavior more socially acceptable. First of all, if we look at that red, we can see as behavior is more socially acceptable, seemingly there's less infection happening overall in the community. But there's something really interesting happening in the green. We seem to have this hill structure happening, which is the situation of when behavior is not very social, we can see a certain number of infections. As behavior becomes more social in that green, we start seeing more infections. So it kind of looks like things are getting worse because we're seeing more of it. But if it becomes really social, we go back down to seeing less infections. And something really interesting to note here is if we look at these two X's on that green, approximately the epidemic looks exactly the same, or the endemic state looks exactly the same under those two scenarios. But if we compare that to the red, the actual infection burden is very, very different. So what we infer from this is it's really important to understand what the behavioral landscape with respect to testing is in your population to be able to try and understand what the actual burden of the infection is going forward. Now, that's a quick overview. And obviously, Ed and I are here for 4 weeks, and you're going to be stuck with us for a lot of it. So please come and chat to us. But also, there's all these places you can see connect with us if you don't want to speak in person. So thank you.